Egypt has always traditionally been given prominence as the height of ancient culture. Nubia is now coming into its own and is being understood to be of equal importance. It is different from ancient Egypt, but it is equally important and not just an adjunct to this Egyptian culture. What archaeologists do when they pull material from the ground or when they translate texts, they bring their own cultural baggage to that interpretation and the baggage of the times that they live in. And so it's imperative that we go back and continually reassess the things that we take as facts. Many of the early archaeologists came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible. And it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies. And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black. And this was how they took Egypt out of Africa and put it into this Semitic sphere, this biblical sphere. And it's only in recent decades, the last 3-4 decades, that Egyptology has really moved away from that. And scholars who are studying Nubia are really given the chance to give a voice to this Nubian material that it wasn't given much of a chance to have in the past. Someone asks me, what was the ancient Egyptians' view of X? I immediately think of a two-pronged view, because the ancient Egyptians had an official view of many things, and this is the view that would be put up on the walls of temples and on the walls of the tombs of the elites. That was an official, let's say, state-sanctioned view. That bore little to no resemblance to what people actually may have thought. It was the official view. So when you look at Nubia as depicted on the walls of temples in Egypt, you will see Nubians being crushed under the chariot wheels of the king. You will see Nubians being dragged back to Egypt enslaved. What we see on the ground in terms of archaeological evidence is quite different. We see people who had Nubian names, people who were using Nubian material culture, living within Egypt, working in Egypt, marrying people with Egyptian names. So something quite different from the very intense militaristic scenes that you see in temples. When George Reisner excavated Kerma, he found the statue, a large, beautiful statue of Senui, and also a statue partially destroyed of Jaffa Happy, her husband. It was a very large tomb, and with size in Egypt and in Nubia, we tend to assume ruler or someone very important, which usually translates to ruler. We now understand, yes, this was a ruler's tomb. It is a completely different time period than Jaffa Happy and Senui lived in. Much later, we understand it to be a local ruler, so it was a Kerman official who, for reasons we can guess at, brought or had these two statues brought to Kerma and put in his tomb. It could have been an appropriation of Egyptian culture in general, just to show that, yes, I can own these things that are Egyptian wonderful works of art. Because what we're saying, if you read between the lines, is whoever owns these statues is a powerful person. And that means this art has power.
Greetings, everyone. This is your brother asarimhotep with the Madhu Mandela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. And what you were watching was a clip from, and I'm not sure what documentary that is, but I believe it's for the museum, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, on Nubia. And who was speaking is our guest for today, Dr. Vanessa Davies, who is an Egyptologist, and we're going to talk about a number of things, including her work as an Egyptologist and epigrapher, as well as some of her latest research on the relationship between W.B. Du Bois and William Flinders Petrie. And so I like to welcome our guest. You can unmute your mic now. Dr. Vanessa Davies, how are you doing this afternoon?
Fine. Thank you for inviting me, Asar.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I can stop sharing my screen. And I just learned something today, and that is while I'm sharing my screen, my notifications will stop the play. So I got to take off the notifications for the future. But welcome, welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to have a conversation with me and my audience. And speaking of my audience, I want to thank all of you who are listening live, and of course, all of you in the future who will be catching the archive. Shout out to everyone who is in the YouTube chat, as well as those who are on Facebook. And so we appreciate you. So thank you, Tim Clark, Ivan, Cassius, Gary, Essie, Angry Pharaoh, Jean-Claude Mboli, Christopher Cager, First In, Last Out, Talib, Rahman, and there was somebody else. Brother Chavez, I see you. Brother Any Herod, I see you. Asiatic Black Man 19, I see you too. We have some interesting names. I see you, Brother Kuta Khan, aka OG Gorilla. It's his other name, and Phi Lighten. What is this? Tist. Peace to you, peace to you. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for joining us. And so, without further ado, given that you are new to this program, can you please tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and if you don't mind, kind of giving us a history of how you became interested in doing what you do.
Sure. Let me say again how happy I am to be here today talking with you and with your internet community. I really appreciate the invitation to be here, and I appreciate you all attending. So my name is Vanessa Davies, and I'm an Egyptologist. I work primarily on the sort of art and texts that you find on the walls of temples and tombs. I do a little bit in the realm of archaeology. And I came to the study of ancient Egypt through modern Egypt, really. I'm from Pennsylvania. Right now I live in Philadelphia. And I grew up in a really tiny, tiny town in north central PA. And when I went to college, the thing I wanted to do most was study Arabic, because my mother's family is from Lebanon, and my mother grew up speaking Arabic, but she never taught us because my father didn't speak Arabic, and she didn't want to isolate him through the language, so she never taught us. And as a young person, this made me very angry. And so I thought, the first thing I'm going to do when I get a chance is study Arabic. And I went to college. I started studying Arabic right away. And my Arabic professor said, if you really want to learn this language, you need to go live somewhere where people are speaking it every day so that you can be working on it at all times. And my university had a relationship with the American University in Cairo. So I went abroad to Cairo. This was in the early 90s. It was like 1992, maybe. And so, here I am from this tiny town. I mean, the population of the town I grew up in is 3,000 people. And I show up in Cairo, and this place blew my mind. I loved it from the moment I got there. It's crazy, it's chaotic. There's people and noises and sights and sounds, and I loved it. And I loved how all of these ancient monuments are right there among all of the people who are living, not just in Cairo, but up and down the Nile River. It's the ancient and the contemporary are together at all times. And so anyway, at the time I was studying Arabic. I was really focused on modern Egypt. I wanted to understand Islam. I wanted to understand the role of women in Islam. And that was really where my focus was. And then after that, the next year, I started working on an archaeological dig. At that time, undergraduates couldn't work in Egypt on archaeological digs. So I worked on a dig in Jordan, again, to practice my Arabic, but to get some experience with archaeology. And I did that for 2 summers, which was fantastic. But at the end of my dig season, every summer in Jordan, I would go back to Egypt. And I would just travel around by myself for 2 weeks, basically, before I went home, because like Egypt just kept calling to me. I was like, I'm right here, right here in Jordan. And so life went on, and I went to graduate school in Islamic studies. I taught for a while in that field, but basically I couldn't shake Egypt is how I look at it. And when I was teaching, I was living at this time in Southwest Virginia, and I was teaching at a liberal arts college there. And the man who was chair of the department, I was in the history department, the man who's the chair of the department, who I'm still very good friends with, said to me, you need to go get a PhD, because I had a master's degree. He's like, you need to get a PhD. You're very interested in Egypt. You need to think about that. And I really took his words to heart. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this, and I'll send out applications. I'll see what happens, right? It's out of my hands at that point. And sure enough, I got accepted to a few different programs, and I thought, okay, well, this is it. I'm going to get to become an Egyptologist. And I did. I went to graduate school, got a PhD in Egyptology, and was able to work in Egypt while I was a graduate student. So I've sort of been going back to Egypt on and off over the years, ever since the early 90s. And I still can't shake it. I still love it. And so, yeah, that's how I came to this field.
I see. So indirectly, unintended, in our community, we would say the ancestors were guiding you towards your destiny, so to speak. But for those who haven't been to Cairo, I think it's like 10 million or more, or like it's even more than that, people in Cairo by itself.
I feel like it's even more than that these days. Yeah. It's enormous.
Yeah. When I went, because that's where you land when you first come into the country. And yes, it's a lot of people, and it's real busy in Cairo. So I think everything spreads out from Cairo, so everyone lands. So of course everybody comes there. So all the hustle and bustle is right there. So that's very interesting. So how did you? I guess your focus now is like on epigraphy, and so how did you? Well, first, what is it? What is epigraphing? And then what made you interested in that specifically, in terms of the wide range of focus that any Egyptologist, could be doing?
So what is it? Let's start with that. It's basically the study of the art and the texts that are on any vertical surface. So anything that's on the walls of temples and tombs or on a stela, because that's, you know, set up in the ground, any of that that gets studied, that's within the realm of epigraphy.
So that doesn't include the pottery. So if there's writing on pottery, is that included in there or not?
No, not usually. So usually that sort of thing is under the umbrella of paleography, which that's the study of things like papyri and potsherds and things that are more horizontal, let's say. So I mean, that's sort of my easy distinction is vertical versus horizontal. So for me, I mean, the first thing that struck me as a young college student was the art of ancient Egypt. I loved the art, and long before I could ever read hieroglyphs, I was drawn to the wall art. So that's why I was specifically drawn to epigraphy, was to study that art, to study the hieroglyphic text. It's usually hieroglyphic texts that are around it. And then you have to keep in mind that the texts, when they're written in hieroglyphs, are themselves little pieces of art, right? So that's why when I talk about what's on the walls, I'll talk of it as decoration, because some of it actually might be text, but it is still art. And then you have large figural art, like the large figures in your background behind you. So when you're doing epigraphy, you're typically up at your wall or your stele or whatever your vertical surface is. You're up there, you're really close. You're drawing what's there. You'll do a very careful, detailed drawing, and the drawing will, I mean, methods differ, but often the epigrapher will include everything that's there, including like if there's any modern graffiti that's been added to it, or a lot of times you'll find Christian era graffiti, so like crosses will be drawn on there. Any damage to the text in the image, whether it's intentional or whether it's not intentional, all that stuff gets recorded. So it's a very accurate drawing of what's on the wall today, and that's important because a lot of these surfaces are deteriorating. Sometimes because of rising groundwater that makes the salt leach out of the stone, and then the salt will cake on the surface of the stone. And when the salt flakes off, it takes the decoration with it. So we're losing a lot of these images for those reasons, and various other reasons as well. So epigraphy gives us a record of what's there, preserves it. You publish that in the book, then people have it. But also tied up in that will be translating the text, if there's a text there, interpreting what's going on, trying to explain what's happening in the image, to put it in its historical context, right? To, if it was a king who put it up, to talk about that king, why it was erected there, to set it up in its architectural space, to show what else is around it. So really to try to flesh out as much meaning as you can from that vertical scene. So that's what epigraphy is. And I was lucky enough when I was in graduate school to work on a team of epigraphers in Egypt. So we lived over there for 6 months, and we were working at a site called Medina Habu, which is on the west bank of the river down at Luxor. And we were working in a temple there, recording the decoration on the walls. It was a fantastic experience.
I know that, like, you know, way back in the day, at the time of Petrie, who we'll discuss a bit more deeply later, that, you know, everyone didn't have access to cameras like we do today. So when you go there now, do people sit there, you know, during the day and draw? Or is it more now because of the cameras, they can just take the photo and then, you know, blow it up later and draw? So is it still the folks who just sit there and draw live what they see, or is it kind of a mix? How do they do it today?
Mix. a lot of it depends on how much funding a particular team has, because there are teams from countries all over the world who do this, and they apply to the Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt, and they get permission to work a particular site or a particular temple, and no one else will work that site except for that team. And so if the team has enough funding to stay for a long period of time, what they'll do is they'll take a picture and they'll work from that picture, but they'll spend every day that they're there at the wall, drawing on top of the picture. And most of the drawing now happens electronically. When I was there, which was in around 2004, 2005, we were still drawing it on paper. Paper, and you're drawing on top of the photograph. Now a lot of that, the photograph's in your digital tablet and you're drawing on the tablet. So if you have the money to support your team to stay over there for a long period of time, you're at the wall every day. And the reason is because your photograph, as good as it is, can't capture every single detail that your eye can capture. Because a lot of the markings are very faint today. And so you have to be like literally that close to it to see some of them. If you don't have enough funding for your team to stay over there for months on end, then you take your pictures, you work on your pictures, and when, wherever your home base is, and when you go to the field, you just check your drawings against the wall. So you're not actually drawing at the wall, but you're still checking them with your eyes at the wall. Because you need to have kind of a double check on your photograph.
Yeah, it would seem very difficult, especially when you think about how tall a lot of these monuments are, to get the glyphs that, because for those who haven't been to Egypt, you have these super tall columns, and then you have writings on the ceilings in certain areas. So I can't imagine y'all hanging from the pillars and then drawing at the top, but that would be interesting to see nonetheless. But you mentioned paleography earlier, and so I want you to talk about the recent book that you co-edited that deals with epigraphy and paleography. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
I have a copy here. I wanted to show you the picture because I love it. My co-editor Dimitri picked out the picture, and it's an old drawing from it's out of copy right now, but it's from the late 1700s. And I love this. I'm trying to get it in my camera. I love this drawing because you've got the epigrapher here sitting, doing his drawing of this monument, and then you have, over here, you have a soldier with a bayonet walking by. And I love this drawing because I think that's such a poignant image. This was a drawing that was done by a team of scientists that were sent to Egypt by Napoleon. That's what it's representing, is the fact that this was a scientific mission, but it was also a military mission. Anyway, so the handbook just came out right before the health crisis sort of shut a lot of places in the US down, but it's the Oxford Handbook of Egyptian Epigraphy and Paleography. And I came up with the idea for this handbook because as a professor, when I was teaching, I wanted a text to be able to hand my students to help them learn what epigraphy and paleography are all about. And there was no text, there was nothing. When I was a graduate student, I asked my professor for a text, and he said, well, you just learn this in the field, you'll pick it up there. But I thought, not every person has the opportunity to work in the field, and I wanted this to be available for people who couldn't just learn it in the field. So I contacted my colleague, Dimitri, who is an Egyptologist who lives in Belgium. And I asked him if he wanted to collaborate with me on this, because I knew he would have a lot more contacts with the European community than I did, so he could it would be easier for him to sort of coordinate things on that continent. I could coordinate things here together. We'd coordinate things in other parts of the world like Egypt and Australia and the Far East. And so we put together this volume. There are 47 different authors who are represented in it. So 47 chapters, and it's comprehensive. It explains what epigraphy and paleography are. It talks about different teams' methods, because there's so many different methods to do this work. And it talks about why we do this work. It talks about historical efforts. So the ways, for instance, that the ancient Egyptians were copying ancient Egyptian wall decoration. The ways that when Egypt was under when the Islamic conquest had happened and Egypt became part of the Islamic Empire, how the Islamic community in Egypt were copying wall decoration, how in Renaissance Europe it was copied. We went on and on and on through history to show historical methods and reactions to these texts, and then how we're doing it today.
All right. Now, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit here. And by the way, I do have a copy of that text, and I'm just a stickler for method. And so any time that someone releases a methodology book, I like to get those. So I'm understanding what the professionals in that particular field, how they go about more so reducing errors in, how they do what they do. That's what I look for. So I know how to evaluate those things in my own research. And so it came right on time. I will continue. I haven't read it all, but I've been reading it.
Yeah, it's long. And it's so I was checking the date on the cover image. It's 1809 is when it was published. So
all right.
There you go.
And so switching gears, you have, well, I should first say that I was introduced to you by another colleague who I've had recently, on the show, Dr. Shamarka Keita. And when I first met you, when we were talking, you had mentioned, the research you were doing in terms of, the quieted voices of scholars and their contributions to Egyptology that happen to be of African descent, and more specifically in the early formations of Egyptology. And so I wanted you to kind of, discuss that, because if I recall, I think you're actually working on a text along those lines. So if you can kind of talk about, what motivated you to begin that discussion, because that is something that you don't normally see outside of the African world community in terms of a research focus, in terms of the contributions and discussions of African and African descended scholars in the world of Egyptology. So if you can give us a little background and context of all of that.
Sure. So when I was teaching Egyptology, as a professor teaching this topic, most of my students were not planning on becoming Egyptologists. Most of them were interested in ancient Egypt, thought it was cool, were drawn to the class for some reason. I mean, a few of them were just taking it to mark off a requirement, but most of them had a reason for taking the class, but they weren't really planning to become an Egyptologist. And so as a professor, I was grappling with this issue of I want to teach this material, I know the vast majority of these students are not going to become professionals in this field. I want to make this material relevant to them. And so I started doing projects with my students where they could look for ways in popular culture that ancient Egypt shows up, ways that ancient Egypt is used by different people in a sort of pop culture context. And that was really very fun, and it was very enlightening to me as well. I learned a tremendous amount from my students. So, like, one of the examples that sticks with me is the song by Michael Jackson, Remember the Time, which was a song I knew very well, but I never seen a video to it. And one of my students, as his project, showed us this video in class and talked about the ancient Egyptian imagery in it. And it blew my mind because I knew the song, but I had never seen the video, and seeing the video gives you such a different perspective on the song. Mm-hmm. And there were all sorts of other things. There's a Presbyterian church in Nashville, Tennessee, that the inside of it looks exactly like an ancient Egyptian temple. I mean, it's painted, it's got lotus columns, it's the whole 9 yards of an ancient Egyptian multicolored painted temple, and it's a Presbyterian church.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, and there's so many more things. There's early 20th century ads from Palmolive, you know, the dish soap,
mm-hmm.
you know, softens hands while you do dishes. In the early 1900s, Palmolive ads were using all this ancient Egyptian imagery and it never occurred to me before that their name is made up of the words palm and olive, and they were drawing on this connection with that part of the world. And so anyway, my students were coming up with all these amazing connections between contemporary or near contemporary culture and ancient Egypt. And that was great, and I loved it. But I felt like we need to do a little bit more. And so this is like me developing my courses over the years. In one particular course, I had come across an editorial that Marcus Garvey wrote in his newspaper, The Negro World. And this editorial, it was from the early 20s. He was calling out the Egyptologist at Harvard, George Reisner, the guy I spoke about in the video. Marcus Garvey was calling out George Reisner because George Reisner would publish in print and also say in lectures that he gave around the country that ancient Egyptians were white. And so Marcus Garvey wrote about this in his editorial and explained why this wasn't correct and gave his perspective on the issue. And so I decided, okay, I need to incorporate this into our class because this is a really great cultural moment. I had never heard of this before. I knew that no Egyptologists that I knew about this editorial. So I was like, okay, I'm going to bring this to my students. I was very excited. So the day that we went over this in my class, the students were super engaged with this issue, and it was blowing their mind as much as it blew mine. Like, who knew that Marcus Garvey was, you know, writing an editorial about ancient Egypt? My students wouldn't leave when class was over. And, like, the next class was like knocking on the door trying to get in, and my students were so into this, they wanted to keep talking about it. They didn't leave, and I kind of had to be like, we have to go. There's another class, you know. But I realized, like, okay, this type of thing, this makes ancient Egypt relevant to students today. This is important. I need to keep going with this. I need to flesh this out. And so I started looking. I was like, okay, what other scholars of African descent have engaged with Egyptology as a discipline, or with Egyptologists in the way that Marcus Garvey was engaging with George Reisner? And all of a sudden I started finding story after story after story of scholars of African descent in the US who played a role in the history of Egyptology as a university discipline and they weren't a part of the disciplinary history as we talk about it, as we teach it, as most people even know about. Like, just no one knows these stories. And so I was like, all right, I have to flesh out these stories. I have to start telling these stories, and I'm including them. They are part of our disciplinary history. And so I'm going around the country giving talks about this to inform people, because these stories have sort of been lost.
Mhm. Indeed. I think about like one of the earliest in the 1800s. What's his name? Antonin Fuhrman. You familiar with him? Yes. And his engagement. And, you know, many people may not realize, and I don't even know if you've looked at it from this angle as well, you know, because I belong to, in my undergrad days, a pleasure organization by the name of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, which was founded in 1906. So if you know about that organization, you know, from the beginning, the Sphinx was one of our, you know, motifs, and always identified with the Nile itself. And so even the acronym Alpha Phi Alpha is the first brotherhood of the Ethiopians. And so we have records, you know, because one of the founders studied Greek, and he was trying to figure out the last, you know, something for the last A in Alpha Phi Alpha when they formed the organization. And the professor told him, you know, why not, you know, because, you know, they spelled it Ethiopians, you know, saying with the alpha. So it became the first because Alpha Phi, you know, for brother, you know, the Ethiopians. And so it's been a long tradition, you know, of these kinds of engagements from that time, you know, saying forward. And of course now it's just, you know, really, really everywhere. So you recently wrote a paper titled W.B. Dubois, A New Voice in Egyptology's Disciplinary History. Is currently published under the Ankh Journal. Can you tell us a little bit about, because I know that's related to what you just said, but that hones in on a more specific engagement in the early days of Egyptology, and with a person who is very well known and important to Egyptology, Williams Flinders Petrie.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about, you know, that paper and what is discussed in it?
Sure. So yeah, that paper grew out of the larger project that I just described, which is bringing the voices of scholars of African descent into the disciplinary history of Egyptology. So one of the relationships that I uncovered when I was doing this research, the research that started with Marcus Garvey, was these sets of letters that were exchanged between W.B. Du Bois and a British archaeologist who is an Egyptologist, William Matthew Flinders Petrie. So Petrie, if you haven't heard of him, is very famous within Egyptology because, for one thing, he was active for decades, 60 years. He published a tremendous amount. But the sort of crowning achievement of his career is that he was the person who transformed archaeology from a sort of haphazard treasure hunting for, you know, quote unquote, beautiful objects into a methodical scientific pursuit where the archaeologist is looking for all evidence of the ancient culture, not just things that are beautiful. And the archaeologist is recording the results of the excavations. is taking pictures, is publishing this material, that it's not just a treasure hunt. So he was critical for establishing archaeology as a scientific discipline. So all Egyptologists are familiar with his name, even if they haven't read his work or anything. But no one knew that he was corresponding with W.B. Du Bois. So this was yet another example that I found of a Black scholar who had a relationship with the discipline of Egyptology, but wasn't a part of our disciplinary history. So let me give you the background on their relationship. You might know that Du Bois, at various points in his career, was putting together an Encyclopedia Africana, which was going to be a kind of counterpoint to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Early in the 20th century, when he was working on this project, so the early 1900s, he put together a board of advisors, and this was a board of advisors for the encyclopedia. One of the advisors for the encyclopedia was Flinders Petrie. And so in that role, he and the other advisors would sort of maybe give advice on what topics should be represented in the encyclopedia, but they weren't authoring the encyclopedia. Du Bois wanted that work to be done by scholars of African descent. So that was how they first sort of came to know each other, was when Du Bois enlisted him to be on this board of advisors. The letters that I found that are the focus of the article that you're showing are letters that they exchanged in a few years after that, after they had already sort of set up this relationship through the encyclopedia. And what happened was Du Bois had gone over to London to attend a conference. And while he was there, he met Petrie, and he gave him a copy of the book that he had published, which was called The Souls of Black Folk. And so Petrie goes off that winter to excavate in Egypt, like he did every year. And he's in Egypt excavating, and he has to have an emergency operation. And so while he's recovering from this operation in Egypt, he has time to read. And so he reads Du Bois' book, The Souls of Black Folk. And then he starts writing to Du Bois his sort of reflections and his response to this book. And the letter is fascinating because, so here's this white British man writing to Du Bois saying, I really appreciate this book that you've written. I've been wanting to understand the nature of relationships between sort of white folk and black folk in the US. I've been wanting to understand what he referred to as the Negro problem. And your book was fantastic. It explained all of that to me. And then Petrie says, let me give you my reflections on this. And what he goes on to say in this letter is very troubling. He starts talking about how, he doesn't think that education is necessary for modern Egyptians. He thinks that it could actually do more damage to them than it could help them. He talks about how the Egyptians who work for him on his archaeological excavations, he can teach them what they need to know. They don't need to go to school for that. He can train them, he can teach them, end of story, right? So he's simply failing to grasp Du Bois's point about education, which is that education, yes, it's important to learn a trade, to earn a living, but it's equally or perhaps more important for opening the student's mind and for showing them perspectives other than the perspectives that they grew up in, right? But Petrie missed that point entirely and is focused only on, well, this is what I need for my archaeological excavations. I can provide them what they need to know. Boom, boom. They don't need education. So, Du Bois is not pleased with this letter that Petrie sends to him. And so he writes him back. And he's like, listen, these are all the reasons I disagree with what you're saying. And he says, he brings it home to himself. He says, there were a lot of people who were saying the same thing to my parents about educating me. And if my parents had listened to that advice, I wouldn't be writing these letters with you now, would I? He's like, I would probably be one of those people working for you on a dig. And so Petrie receives this letter, still in Egypt, still working on his excavation. He receives this letter. He sees that Dubois is very upset with the response that he had given to the book. And so he writes Dubois back, and he sort of tries to back it up a little bit. And he says, you know, I'm not saying that education's not good for everyone, but, you know, we should be careful with how we administer it, that sort of thing. And he basically tries to smooth it over with Dubois. And so then Dubois had asked him when he wrote him, he said, can I have your permission to publish these letters? You know, and Petrie said, yes. When he wrote him back, he was like, yeah, you have my permission to publish these letters. And so Dubois published them in The Crisis, which was how I first found them, was going through old issues of The Crisis, which back then had an Egyptianizing masthead, which is fantastic. It's a head of an ancient Egyptian king, and Dubois has had the lines on his face drawn very close, right? So he's clearly got dark skin, and the sort of logo under The Crisis says the record of the darker races, right? That's how The Crisis was billed, right? So this Egyptian king is of a darker race, clearly. So anyway, I found these letters in The Crisis where Dubois had published them, and again, I was just struck by the fact that this is a part of the disciplinary history of Egyptology that Egyptologists just don't hear about, and they need to hear about it. And the public as well needs to hear about this. People need to know that these scholars were contributing to the formation of the discipline in the US. And now my work specifically focuses on the early 20th century. I mean, Black scholars, of course, are continually contributing to the discipline. It's just that my research focuses basically on 1900 to 1925.
So this would be way before the time of both Diop and Obenga, who well, I guess Fuhrman would actually be the first,
yes,
to engage with a knowledge of the hieroglyphs itself, the Egyptological community. But I don't believe Dubois had any knowledge of hieroglyphs at all. That's but I remember like reading some of his stuff. Like he would even compare, like he was one of the earliest, to my knowledge, to compare certain archaeology of ancient Egypt with Central Africa in terms of bolts and beads and things of that nature. So it makes sense given the conversations that you said that they had, and you know what he, you know, so what you speak about in that specific article, those personal conversations, you know, saying regarding, you know, race and education and you know, intellect and all of this other kind of stuff and kind of history. But is there any specific conversations regarding, you know, anything that is strictly Egyptology in terms of archaeology, in terms of history of ancient Egypt between them two, or are we to assume that you know was just part of the unrecorded conversations? You know, like what would he have, what did he learn specifically? What information did he get in terms of Dubois specifically from Petrie? You know, that may have, you know, gotten into some of his books regarding, you know, African people.
So a lot and not just from Petrie, but so Du Bois, you're right. Let me back up to what you said a second ago. You're right. Du Bois never had knowledge of reading hieroglyphs, but he was super knowledgeable in terms of reading the history of ancient Egypt as it was being written in his day, right? It's being written differently today, but he was very much engaged with the histories that were being put out, not just by Petrie, but I mean, there's a laundry list of Egyptologists who Du Bois had read and engaged with in a number of his books. And one of them, I think it's The World in Africa. In the intro, Du Bois, now this is a book Du Bois wrote later in life. And Du Bois says in the intro, like, I'm not an Egyptologist. That goes without saying. I've just read these works. And then he starts like listing all these Egyptologists whose works he goes on to cite in his book. And Du Bois's whole point, I mean, from the beginning of his career to the end, was that people in his day were arguing that there was no history of Africa. And so Du Bois was setting out to prove the opposite. And Egypt was one piece of that puzzle. I mean, he wrote about all parts of Africa, but Egypt was part of that. And it was Du Bois's way of saying, yes, there's a history to Africa. And yes, people of African descent have participated in the world's history. I mean, it's the sort of claim that to me blows my mind today, that people were even making this claim, but they were, and they were very serious about it. And this was what he was fighting. So he derived a tremendous amount of material from Petrie's work and from the work of all these other Egyptologists whose books he had read. And the interesting thing about Du Bois too is that despite that particular disagreement that they had in those sets of letters that I uncovered from 1912, it didn't diminish Petrie as an Egyptologist in Du Bois's mind. And the reason we know that is that much later in life, Du Bois was writing a letter to someone recounting his work on this encyclopedia in the earlier part of the 20th century. And he said, I had signed on these various people to be advisors to the encyclopedia, including Flinders Petrie, the greatest Egyptologist of all time. So despite this sort of very basic philosophical disagreement that they had, Du Bois still respected him as an Egyptologist, as a writer of history, if not, agreed with his perspective on educating modern Egyptians.
If we recall, Petrie wasn't formally trained as an archaeologist or whatnot, but he became, one of the most influential, as far as Egyptology is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned the kind of social environment, of course, in this early period, and the race and power relations and how that or permeated, I should say, into the literature regarding history and things.
Mm-hmm.
And this has to be kept in mind when you think about like the early works of Diop coming in the 40s and 50s, that was still a strong thing. Like it was still being argued whether humanity came out of Africa or not, or was the polygenesis hypothesis valid.
Mm-hmm.
But as you can see, as based on your commentary from Garvey to Du Bois, and then extending on to Diop, or actually going back further to Antoine, this is, at least in the African world community, there's always been this engagement of trying to argue the Africanness, of the Egyptians coming from the late 1800s. And that seems to, even to this modern day, still be a hot topic and issue. Basically 100 years later. And so I wanted to get your perspective, in how, because I'm pretty sure that when you're having these conversations, that this is like the underlying, string and theme in these conversations concerning these conversations and contributions of these early African and African American scholars. How do you view the whole racial conversation about the ancient Egyptians themselves? Like, how would you articulate that conversation? How would you navigate that conversation?
That's a big question. Because my mind sort of goes in two different directions, because I think of the ancient art, and then I think of contemporary realities. So let me try to answer both of the ways my mind is going. For the ancient art, a lot of people will point to that and say, oh, the ancient Egyptians didn't depict themselves with black skin. They depicted men as red and women as yellow and whatever. My answer to that goes back to my work in epigraphy, which is the wall decoration that you see in tombs and temples and stelae is it's a very particular genre. And so it's communicating in a very specific way. And to make it easy for people to understand, I equate it to magazine advertisements. So if you flip through magazines and you look only at ads for sports cars, you will see people who are very glamorous. And the question is, do all people who drive sports cars, are they all glamorous? Well, in the world of magazine ads, the answer is yes. In the world that we inhabit, the answer is, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And that's Egyptian wall decoration. So when you think about, for instance, how men are depicted physically in Egyptian wall art, you have very broad shoulders, you have very narrow waists, they're very muscular. Did every Egyptian man look that way? In the reality of Egyptian wall art, yes. In the reality that people lived in ancient Egypt, maybe some of them did. Certainly not all of them. So to look at that wall art and the skin color in that wall art to find a contemporary lived reality is an error. On walls, yes, you will typically see men with red skin and women with yellow skin. That doesn't translate to a lived reality for those ancient people. So that's one half of my answer. The other half of my answer, which relates to our contemporary reality, is, and this I think is a stumbling block when Americans have this conversation with people who aren't American. Because in America, we have a specific understanding of what constitutes Black in terms of race, right? Because we grew up in this environment where we have this one drop rule, right? Where people in Egypt, for instance, many people in Egypt would say that their skin tone is not Black. But if you brought them to the American South in 1940, they would very much be Black. So there's kind of a cross-cultural misunderstanding of what we're talking about when we talk about Black. So my answer is they all were Black in an American sense. In the sense of the Jim Crow South, Black.
Okay, so how should I say this? Because, well, at least people who are familiar with me and my time, I know I've been debating for darn near 20 years on the issue of Kemet, the name, the etymology, and how it's applied. And so, of course, Diop in 1974, and more formally in 1977, put forth this argument that Kemet means black people. And when I looked at it, it didn't resonate with me because I was looking for, well, where in the original text do they name other people by color? And if we assume that they are black in the American sense, as you would say, what about the people around them who were black? Why didn't they call them? And you had to come to the conclusion that they didn't have our modern construct of race. They wouldn't have known what you were talking about then. So, we have this issue, of course, of us, what I call retrojecting, modern paradigms and conceptualizations on ancient people who have not developed that. But it does bring in the question of, because we know that ancient Egypt, even in the 4th millennium BCE, had relationships, trade relationships with people in the Levant, and further into what we call now the Middle East, and possibly, southern parts of Europe. And we know that people migrated in and settled, and some of those people are depicted in the artwork as Egyptians. And so what I find lacking in the conversation is distinguishing, an Egyptian by blood and heritage versus an Egyptian by citizenship. Just like you talk about in the Americas, like most folks would consider you and I to be of two different races, but we are Americans by citizenship. And so if somebody was to in the future say, well, the Americans were black because they only did excavations in the south side of Atlanta, it would be erroneous, knowing that there's a mix, of people in the area. So, is it even possible, based on the records, to even distinguish between the Remech based on, language and blood history versus those who came and settled? And I guess they would just be first generation, foreigners. But as time progresses and they're, of course, intermarrying and having children, through the subsequent generations, like, are they not the Remech now? Are they not Egyptians? How do we, navigate that bit of history, that complexity, and then have this discussion about, were the Egyptians black or not?
Yes.
Or white, or whatever, other people are claiming.
Yeah.
In these various different literatures.
Yeah, I totally see where you're coming from, and I'm totally on board with this. And added to that, I would say that a simple sort of black or white dichotomy doesn't allow for a range of variables along the Nile River Valley, not only from immigration from the Levant and elsewhere in Asia, like you mentioned, but also just natural variation. I mean, this is something that Mark Ikeda talks about a lot. There isn't one type of African, so there would have been variation existing along the Nile River Valley that becomes additionally variable because of the immigration that you talk about. And I mean, I'll give you my own life example. I mentioned that my mom's family is from Lebanon.
Yeah.
Growing up, when I would say to people like, "Oh, I'm Lebanese," they would always say to me like, "Well, you don't look like an Arab." Right. Which, things like my skin's not dark enough, I mean, certainly my nose is big enough, so that works, and my eyes are the right shape. So it's really a skin tone comment that people have made to me my whole life, and it's always annoyed me because I'm like, listen, I'm Lebanese. I know my Lebanese relatives, they look just like me. I don't look like my dad's side of the family. My dad is from England. and I don't look like his side of the family. And so all my life, I've sort of been very annoyed by this. And as an adult, I had the chance to go to Lebanon and go to the village that my mother's family comes from, which is way up in the mountains, way, way, way up in the mountains on this treacherous, windy road. And I get up there. I mean, there's like 4 families in this village. I get up there and the people walking down the street, it's like going through my family album. They all look just like me. Their hair, their nose, their eyes, and their skin tone. And I felt like so vindicated to everyone in my life who's told me that I don't look Arab, because they look just like me. So there is a variation in skin tone among Arabs. There is a variation in skin tone in the Nile River Valley.
Yeah, it's funny because the last time I was in Egypt was in 2015, and we were traveling on a boat in Aswan, and we're going down the Nile, or I guess up the Nile technically, and you just randomly see a whole family of Syrian refugees, you know, in the mix of the quote unquote Nubian, you know, village or whatnot. And, you know, to me, that was like just like a living representation of what I know to happen historically, you know, of communities escaping drought, or wars or things of that nature coming into Kemet, and more specifically, the Delta, and many of them keeping their culture, kind of like in the sense of like a Chinatown in the modern age, like having those pockets of where their communities are, you know, in, you know, ancient Kemet. But you know, so, you know, I've gotten away from, at least in my own research, trying to necessarily look for the blackness. I know it's there, I can see it. And of course, you know, you have Greek testimonies, because they knew, you know, even at the time of the Greek rulership, who were the Egyptians, the Remet still stood out enough that they had to comment on their hair and their skin color. And that is something that, you know, is really isn't discussed much. Like, do they take the time to describe the skin color and hair texture of other people who are around them? And if not, you would assume that's because they're more like themselves, they're not distinguished enough. But with the Egyptians, it was such a contrast between them that it warranted, you know, conversation. Then there's other aspects, even though they didn't have a concept of race. Like in a recent presentation I did, I talked about how they're still telling you who they are, even in the hieroglyphs. So like when you look at the word, the D3 hieroglyph in the D3, the Gardner sign list, you know, code, it's of this curly hair pattern. And it is also the symbol for that they use as a determinative for skin color. And so it is pronounced, you know, or at least written IWN for skin, character, you know, and color or whatnot. And, you know, it's one of those unconscious things. It's just like when, you know, when Europeans in the Americas created Band-Aids, they did it in the color of themselves because that was the primary market. It's not like they were consciously thinking, you know, in terms of racial terms of having the distinction. It's just who they are naturally. So when they come to represent these certain things, they're just letting you know that these weren't straight, long-haired people, that this was tightly coiled, that it's in the glyphs itself, as well as their word, you know, saying for skin color, it's a word for dark, you know what I'm saying, and black unto itself. And then when you just see the wood carvings, variations of the ancient Egyptians, you know, the everyday people, as you would say, they don't have that red and yellow, dichotomy, you have to take it for what it is. So, to me, that's not an argument to be had. It's more so I'm trying to cluster, like with my research, I try to cluster in these different areas to see, well, how much of the old ancient culture and language survived in Egypt, and is this detectable in other areas? Because of course I'm involved in linguistics, and we're involved in reconstruction of language families and things. So that's an interest of me. But saying all of that to say, well, I don't see this ending anytime soon. This because it's just people who keep these debates going. But I know your work is focused at least on that subject in the early 20th century. But have you seen much of a difference in terms of the engagement and acknowledgement of African scholars pertaining to Egypt in the modern discussions of Egypt, its histories, and its contributors, from the general mainstream of academia, if we can say?
So you mean, have I seen scholars of African descent, say, who are still alive?
Or still alive, or just in the more recent past? Because I know that yours was like only going up to, I guess, the 1930s. But let's say from the point of Diop in 1950, on to contemporary times. Is that conversation, being made in terms of the more contemporary scholars? And if not, what do you think the reason is?
So Job was the catalyst, right? And so after him, we see a lot more involvement of scholars of African descent engaging with these issues. We see them showing up in history books. Not enough of them, I would say, but I would say we're headed in the right direction, by which I mean we're hearing more and more about scholars from, say, like 1960 on. And certainly scholars who are alive today, we hear a lot about because they're still active, and so we're hearing their voices. So I would say, in a nutshell, some, not enough, but it's growing. It's headed in the right direction. The other thing I wanted to say, going back to something you said earlier, where you said you don't, tell me if I'm misquoting you, but you said something to the effect of you don't really engage with the issue of the race of the ancient Egyptians because race is a modern construct, of course. But is that fair to paraphrase you on that?
Yeah. In general, yeah. So yeah. It's I do, but I don't. Like, that's not a focus,
right?
Yeah.
That's exactly why I wanted to chime in on. Is for sure it is not a focus of my work either. I mean, you asked me the question tonight, so I answered it, but it is not a question that I put forth in my research. I don't engage with that question at all because I don't think it's a valid question to be asking in the context that I'm working in. But I will call out when I see people addressing that question in a way that I think is inappropriate. So, for instance, there was a special that was on the Sci-Fi Channel. Recently, the Lost Kingdom of the Black Pharaohs, and by Black Pharaohs, what they meant were Nubians. And so the entire program was contrasting Nubians and Egyptians on the basis of race. And that is something that I bring up when I give these talks around the country as something that it's simply reviving these antiquated arguments of the early 20th century, the arguments that Marcus Garvey and Dubois were engaging with. And so I will call out those things when I see them, but I don't engage with that question in the same way you said you don't?
Yeah, like for me, it's you mentioned this in the video clip that we played at the beginning, in terms of the early Egyptological literature, and I would argue really kind of it's still strong even to this date, that it's a strong leaning towards trying to understand ancient Egypt through the lens of Semitic speakers in the Levant and surrounding areas. And for me, given the other evidence, especially about the initial ruling class and group of individuals coming out of the Sahara and them coming from the south, I would always wonder, why is the focus on this area? But then you'll see in the literature that the languages are very distinct, the culture is very distinct. Like there's engagements, and we can tell by the pottery and things of this nature that there's trade and things going along, but they are so unique that it has to be mentioned. So why is all the focus there? Why isn't there, if we're trying to understand them, of course, outside of the primary records that the Egyptians left for themselves, if we're going to look for other cultures around them to understand them, why don't they go into the southern parts of Africa where they're from? And it's ironic, even in the biblical text, I forgot what verse it is, when God is, of course, cussing out the the ancient Egyptians, it tells them that he's going to cast them out and bring them to Upper Egypt, where they originated. And that's telling that even in the biblical writers understood that the Egyptians are the ones who came from the south, and which was a Tep Resi. I forgot what the biblical pronunciation of this is. And so it is that bit of evidence and conversation that sparked me to look, further down. But, my personal, like, I didn't plan on engaging, just like you, ancient Egypt this deeply initially. It was a result of a 2001 book that came out by Dr. Fukiao. I had already been studying off and on, ancient Egypt since the late 90s, going into the early 2000s. But when I read his book, he wasn't talking about Egypt. He's just talking about his own culture in the Bantu, among the Bantu Congo in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zaire, or whatnot, just the Key Congo speakers, the Buck Congo people. And when he's giving the mythology and the cosmology and philosophy of his people, I'm like, this sounds exactly like what I'm reading over here in ancient Egypt. And so I wanted to know more about to see if there was a connection. So that's how I got started with the whole Bantu and whatnot. And so then I didn't have the skill set yet to make any kind of serious act. It was just, surface stuff. But now I can engage and be like, nope, that's exactly, they worship Ra and da 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 da. And I can systematically, do that. But that's the way, like, because the race because I'm a scientist first. So if you can't define the thing, precisely, it's an unscientific phenomenon, for me. And this whole concept of race, I can't argue that as a scholar and a scientist. I can't go from that angle because it doesn't exist in the biological world. So, but I can show linguistically and culturally that if we were to group these people called the ancient Egyptians, they would primarily cluster with groups that you would find in Central, West, saying in just East Africa in general. And so that's the nature of the angle, in which I engage it from,
Mm-hmm.
and not, from because if we have evidence of migrations back and forth in this area between different groups who people would consider racial, it is it's a slippery slope, that when you can argue. But I would argue for the most part that using our modern constructs, that the dominant group were people, quote unquote, of Black African and Nubian heritage, or whatnot, in that. And then you had other groups who came, like when we think about Ramesses II, like let's imagine, because I mean, how many wives is allegedly he had? Like 100 or something,
Right.
or whatnot. Let's just yeah. So there's even a condom named after him. Like the sexual prowess of Ramesses is supposed to be great. But imagine, let's just say he had children with 20 of them. And, you have 2,000 years of generations, and he had, relations. He had wives from Assyria, from the Levant, of course, in Africa proper, and things of this nature. So he has his genetic footprint, amongst a whole bunch of people who would in our day assume to have different phenotypes, but those generations would have grown, significantly from the time of Ramesses II. And so, it's just one of those, Dr. Keita and I go through these conversations all the time. But I wanted to, I didn't want to keep you long, so it's been almost an hour and a half. So I wanted to open it up to questions from the people in our chat. And it's going to be a slight time delay, so I'm going to give them a second, and then I will chime them in. And I want to say a special thank you to everyone who has made a contribution to the channel in this episode. I'm acknowledging all the names that went up, and so normally I would, like, if I'm doing my lecture, I acknowledge them as it comes in, but didn't want to interrupt your flow while you were talking. So I just thanking everyone, now. So if you do have a question, whether you are on Facebook or whether you are on YouTube, and I see, and you just got to understand that people argue in my chat, so I got to filter through their own personal arguments in the chat. So, hopefully it's not too bad what's going on over there. But let me see.
A lively group here.
Someone asked on Facebook, was the Greeks and Romans ever in Lebanon?
Yes.
I assume so.
Yes. When I was visiting there, I'm trying to remember what year I was there. I want to say it was like 2011, maybe, when I was in Lebanon. Yeah, one of the sites that I was privileged to visit is the Temple of Baalbek, which is a Roman temple in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. So over kind of edging to the part of Lebanon that's closer to Syria. And it's an amazingly intact temple. The preservation on it is incredible, and it's large, and it's one of the many remnants of Greek and Roman civilization in that area.
I mean, you had the Romans in Nubia.
Yeah.
At the time of Moreau. So like, yeah, they were everywhere.
Yeah.
Let me see. Like, while I'm waiting on questions, do you have any thoughts, since you were talking about the influence and inspiration that Egypt has had in terms of the modern culture and contemporary, even up to as contemporary as the early 1900s was? do you go further back and research, or just have a general understanding of the possible influences of Egypt on the regions around, in terms of, like, Greece, Rome, or the Levant? Like, I could think of one example. I forgot which Ptolemy it was, but it's interesting that we know that they are quote unquote Europeans by the modern, construct of Europeans. But when he's depicted in the Egyptian artwork, he's depicted with the Egyptian colors. I forgot which Ptolemy it is. And, it always struck me that even for the conquering communities, they would still want to adopt the culture of the ancient Egyptians.
Yes.
And so that would tell you, like, just how powerful and strong the culture was, that, even though there was some implementation of their own culture, the native culture was still prominent even when the conquerors came in. But just your understanding, to what degree can we say that there's Egyptian influences in these regions, and in what areas?
So one of the easiest things to point to, I think, because there's a lot of evidence for it, is the cult of Isis. I mean, Isis is an ancient Egyptian deity who was worshipped all over the Mediterranean. And she became a very important divine figure in the Roman Empire. And if you are familiar with the statues that depict Isis holding Horus as a child, people have argued that that's actually the inspiration for the Christian image of Mary holding Jesus as an infant. That imagery of a mother figure holding a divine child figure, some have traced back all the way to ancient Egypt. And to your point about conquerors taking on Egyptian imagery for themselves and occupying important space in Egypt, you can see it even post-Roman Empire, post-conquest, when Christianity becomes the dominant religion in Egypt and supplants the ancient worship. You see Christians occupying the ancient religious spaces. So ancient temples become monasteries, for instance, or ancient temples become churches. I mean, some temples you'll go in today, you'll see an altar with a cross carved on the wall, but the cross is carved into a scene that was originally an ancient Egyptian scene, right? So that's a later Christian addition. And the same with Islam. So if you go to Luxor Temple today, built into one wall of the ancient temple is a mosque that is still in use today. And so that reappropriating of these important religious sites happens by the various religions that that come into Egypt after the ancient religion is no longer widely practiced. And it goes right along in line with what you were saying about ancient conquerors depicting themselves in an Egyptian manner in Egypt on temple walls.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question from Zion Lex, and then I'm gonna go to James Morgan on Facebook. So where did Zion go? Okay, so his question is, how much did the ancient Sumerians influence early Egyptian culture? And I know where he's going with this. So this is, I'm not even going to comment. I'll just ask the question. I'm gonna be fair to you, Zion Lex. All right. Go ahead.
I might suspect where he's going, but I'm not sure. So here's what I will say. There seems to be clear indications that there were cultural connections between the Nile River Valley cultures and the cultures of Mesopotamia in that early sort of proto-dynastic era in Egypt. The extent to the cultural influence is very difficult for me to say. That's not my area of specialty, that early part of the historical record in Egypt. But for sure, there were cultural connections between those two zones, and we see that in art, especially. There have been arguments that have gone back and forth as to which culture predated the other one, and that those aren't really arguments that I have engaged with in my own scholarly work. So I can't say that I am familiar with the original argumentation. The original evidence. I'm aware of the argumentation around the evidence. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at there were definitely cultural connections there.
Alrighty. Going back to Facebook. Where did he go? In Dr. Davies' experience, does the Egyptian government and the Supreme Council of Antiquities have anything to gain by acknowledging Kemet as Black or African of origin?
That's an interesting question. Do they have anything to gain? I mean, to some extent, I don't see how one could argue they're not African. I mean, just at the very fundamental, basic level, it's Africa. It's a Nile River Valley culture. I mean, I can't pretend to know what the current objectives of the Ministry of Antiquities is, because I don't know. What I can speak about sort of in a theoretical sense without knowing anything about what their objectives are, and identification of Egypt with other African cultures. It sets it in this geographical context. And from my perspective as a cultural historian, that is a lot to gain from the perspective of cultural history. But whether or not the ministry shares that view, I can't say, because I don't know anyone personally in the ministry.
All righty. We have a question from Phi Lighten Tist. I don't know how we pronounce that. But if Dr. Davies is familiar with Dr. Frankfurt's work, asks what are her views on how he felt about the Egyptian Ka? Does he agree with him, and why?
So I'm assuming we're talking about Henri Frankfurt. Published a lot in English. So his work on the Ka, I'm stretching back my mind, because his work on the Ka was kind of updated, let's say, in the 80s by Lanny Bell, who also wrote on the Ka. And then no one wrote on the Ka for a couple of decades. At least no one that I'm aware of, let me put it that way. And so Lanny Bell's work is what I'm more familiar with than Frankfurt's. And I know that in recent years, people have started to write about the Ka again. So there are actually a couple of people I know of, and there may be more, who are currently producing stuff on the Ka. So what he said about, I'm really trying to remember. See, Lanny Bell talked about it more as something that lives beyond death, that is it's one of what we call sort of these elements of the soul, that type of thing. And so I'm not sure if the question is asking specifically about that concept, or what about the Ka exactly.
Yeah, the person who asked that question, can you be a little bit more specific in the context of the Ka and what his opinion was about the Ka? I'll re-ask the question later. Someone is asking, have you found the work of Mboli? And that's Jean-Claude Mboli.
No, but thank you for the tip.
Yeah, he's a linguist out of, see, I don't know why he would ask that question, since it's primarily a linguistic work.
Okay.
So, but he has some, based on his research, some differing views on how they categorize the Egyptian language. And so that's probably why that's important to him. Hold on one sec.
The linguistic stuff I leave to Asar.
I'm sorry?
I said the linguistic stuff I leave to Asar.
Yeah, that's how I know, like, see, here's the thing. Everyone assumes that everyone I bring on my program necessarily knows what I know when it comes to certain work. And so, no, everyone has their own expertise and their own research focus. And so
Asar has shared some of his work with me, and I have read it, but I do not have a background in linguistics, so I end up sending him about 80 questions, which he very answers for me.
Yes. So that's something that, a lot of people have to realize just about scholars in general, that, you have a little bit of knowledge in the general, and then you have a more focused knowledge. So they don't know, or we don't know everything when it comes to any particular field. Someone asked, I'm trying to find it so I could post it up here. Okay, here we go. Where can they find your work?
Oh, the website academia.edu, I have a page there, and everything that I've been allowed to load there, I load. Some journals don't give you permission to post your stuff online, or they might have a waiting period of a few years, but everything I've been allowed to post there is there. So the Dubois article is there, and you can download it.
Okay. This one is coming from Dr. Cager, Christopher Cager, off of Facebook. Earlier you spoke about the deteriorating conditions of the art and pictorial writings. Are there any serious scientific and technological efforts to help restore and maintain this ancient history?
Yes. And the efforts taken depend on the particular situation of the temple or the tomb, whatever is being worked on. So there are a lot of conservation efforts going on in Egypt, both by Egyptian teams and by teams coming in from outside who aren't Egyptian. So that's an enormous effort that's underway, and has been underway, I would say, for a good couple of decades at least. So yeah, conservation work. Also, let's say like a kind of very faithful reconstruction or shoring up. So for instance, the step pyramid of Djoser, which you might be familiar with, was really crumbling, especially around the base, and it threatened the integrity of the entire structure. And so some modern supports and blocks were put in, and they're not trying to like reconstruct the whole thing, but they're just trying to shore it up. So a variety of different types of supporting and conservation is being done throughout Egypt. The thing is that there's just so many monuments, there's so many tombs. They can't all be worked on because there just aren't enough resources, but there is a lot of work being done.
Okay, this is going to be the last question, unless the other brother comes back and clarifies what he was asking. Let me post it. What is the oldest period work you, Dr. Davies, have worked on as an epigrapher?
So the oldest period I worked on was New Kingdom, which in the enormous span of ancient Egyptian history isn't the oldest by far, right? But the New Kingdom is my area of specialty in terms of where most of my work is focused. And the particular temple that I was working on in Egypt when I was working on this epigraphic mission, it was a temple that was begun in the New Kingdom, and parts of it were added onto at various points throughout ancient Egyptian history, all the way into the Roman era. But that it's called the Small Temple of Medina Habu. Because there is a much larger temple of Medina Habu that it's actually inside of. It's the large temple walls. So that's the area I was focused on when I was working on that mission.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you taking, again, time out of your busy day in the middle of the week to converse and answer questions with my live audience. I know we spoke earlier and you said that you were, or at least corresponded earlier, besides the work on, I don't know if it's the focus is on Dubois or if for that work, but there was another work that you said that may be more immediately coming out soon.
Oh, right.
Can you talk about that if you would like?
So the book that Dubois, Garvey, and the others factor, and the others who we never even got around to talking about, but I'll tell you quickly, Booker T. Washington's one of them. That book that focuses on scholars of African descent is one that I'm still writing. And so giving these talks around the country helps me to write it. So it's not focused completely on Du Bois, but it is focused on scholars of African descent. But the book that's coming out more immediately, I think it will be out later this year or possibly early next year, is an archaeological publication. It's a project that I worked on for a number of years with a team of researchers. So George Reisner, the archaeologist who used to be at Harvard, who I mentioned in the video, he did a tremendous amount of excavating in Egypt. And like Petrie, he was very driven by a scientific method. So his excavations were careful scientifically, but he didn't publish everything he excavated. He just couldn't keep up with his own excavation work in terms of publishing it. So I was able to secure a grant from the White-Levy program for archaeological publications, and they funded us to research the material that Reisner had excavated between 1903 and 1905 from a couple of cemeteries in Egypt at a site called Nag Adair, which is a site basically in Middle Egypt. And all of the material that we excavated are either at the MFA in Boston or it's at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology, which is on the campus of UC Berkeley. So this material has lain in these museums' collections for over 100 years now, and the material was never published. So this team of experts and I analyzed this material. We wrote chapters. We've put together this book, and so the material will come out later this year.
Indeed. I look forward to that as well. I like the archaeological stuff. It'd be little minor things. I read a whole 400-page book and it'd be one paragraph that I need in the whole text. But thank you again greatly.
Thank you so much. I mean, I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to present my work to this community. And I appreciate the feedback.
Appreciate it. Thank everyone who is listening, of course, live, and those in the archives. Our next guest is going to be Dr. James Conyers, who is the head of the African American Studies program at the University of Houston, where I attended. And I was there when he first got there because he was replacing Dr. Jelani, who had passed away, who was the head of the African American Studies program there at the time. So we're going to catch up with him and the hundreds of books he's written and edited. It seems like 100, but it isn't. But I'm probably not that far off. So we're meeting out the time right now, but it'll probably either be at the end of this week or the beginning of the next week, probably around the same time like this. And Thanks to everyone who has made a financial contribution to the channel. If y'all have any comments and questions, of course, put them in the comments section of this video. Please like this video. Please share this video. And please go to academia.edu and download Dr. Davies' articles and read them and cite them in your work if you are a researcher and scholar. It has been a privilege to have you on the program, and you know, hopefully I'll see you soon when I get back to Philly.
Stay safe
when it opens up.
Yeah, right.
You know, again. But thank you all. And if you have not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel so that you will get the alerts every time I have more wonderful guests such as Dr. Davies. And y'all have a blessed day. Stay safe and see you next time. All right, peace.
Thank you.